And the other thing that you really talked about that was really important was this chart, the most powerful chart in politics today, which demonstrates the difference between someone who went to college and someone who didn't. Can you talk about these assumptions and how they inform policy and have driven us potentially in the wrong direction?
Yeah, sure. And I would start with that chart and actually make a modification to it, which I've only realized recently. I used to talk about that chart exactly in those terms. And I realized that, the distinction isn't so much between went to college or didn't, or, has a degree or doesn't.
And this is earning power.
Yeah, that's right. It's really a much smaller group who got a degree and got a job that required that degree. Because part of the problem, we have this idea that, the future is these kinds of jobs and the economy has all these jobs and we have to educate kids for them. And the reality is we're actually producing new college graduates about twice as fast as the economy is actually adding jobs that require college degrees. So part of that reason you have all these kids who are completing college and not finding jobs that require their degrees, it's not because they're dumb kids or bad at, job interviews or something. It's because the jobs aren't even there. Our education system and our idea of our education system is aligned neither with the reality of people's desires and aptitudes, nor with the reality of our economy. And so, when we think about success, to your second point, which I think is exactly right, I think, again, we have to entirely respect and support the person whose definition of success is to go start that company in Silicon Valley. Obviously, that's incredibly important, and we need those folks. We just have to be aware of how much our view of our culture is skewed by the fact that those are the people who create our culture. And that the stories that get written about in the newspaper, that get made into movies, that get depicted on sitcoms, that those profiles of people, absolutely, there are people like that, but there are at least as many, probably a lot more people not like that. And a successful economy and ultimately a successful nation has to be one that has room for everybody.
I want to talk about the metrics that you would use to define a successful life. But first, I want to talk about any potential generational differences. And I'll use this one anecdote. I don't pretend to represent this as statistically representative data, but I see a lot of these anecdotes out there. I received a pitch from a publisher to interview the author of a book called Okay Boomer. Here's what happened. Basically, it's I'm not sure if you're familiar with it or not, but I read probably 50 pages of it. And I stopped at the point where the author said that the reason that boomers don't understand what her generation, the millennial generation, was going through is because they've done all this economic injustice to us. She said, I can barely afford to pay my law school debt as a freelance writer. And I'm like, okay, well, clearly you're not supposed to be paying your law school debt as a freelance writer. You're supposed to be paying your law school debt as a lawyer who went to NYU. And maybe you hate that job, but you made a commitment when you took those loans on that you're going to have to go eat crap at a white shoe law firm doing research in the library for 5 years until you buy yourself back. Is that a generational thing, or am I just imagining that because I'm an old fogey white guy?
I think there's definitely a generational element to it, which is that there is an attitude among younger people that they are supposed to sort of just be pursuing their dreams and doing what they love, and that they're entitled to have that work out. I think the flip side is we should acknowledge that that is exactly what the culture created by the boomers and older guys such as yourself tells them. That,
I didn't say that. I didn't tell him to follow her bliss.
That when we talk about a generation, it's right to recognize that generations have these different attitudes, but it's not like it's not like there was something different in the water when these kids were gestating, right? It's the culture that they've been raised in. And so right. I think we have two problems. We both have a problem that we've built this culture that somehow suggests, that you can and should just do what you love and pursue your dreams, and that is what you're entitled to, and it is going to work out. But then in conjunction with that, we've built a culture and an economy that says really the only way to make it is to do this set of things. So you are here in high school to prepare for college, because gosh, we sure don't have anything else for you.
Yeah.
And, you're going to go to college to presumably earn some sort of degree, and then you're probably someone's going to tell you really need to go to grad school if you want to get a good job. And so, I actually have a law degree too, and I spend a lot of time talking to people who are thinking about whether or not to go to law school. And there's a lot of advice they need that I would say they're probably not getting, one of which is like, do not go to law school right after college. Even if you're 100% sure you want to be a lawyer, maybe, give it some time, get out there and do something else first. And then second, don't go to law school unless you know exactly why you're going to law school.
Mm-hmm.
And instead we have the message that's been sent. It's like, well, more education is just always better and has an automatic return on investment. So I, on the one hand, have very little sympathy for the freelance writer who's having trouble paying her law school debts, because obviously if you take on the law school debt, you're probably going to have to go be a lawyer to pay for it. But at the same time, I sort of recognize, she was pushed into an education system and set of options and set of messages that was just not a very good one.
Okay, and that's partly culture, but it's partly a system that removes a lot of friction from that decision, because they say, here's what you should be doing. Oh, and by the way, here's a stack of money to pay for it that you're automatically approved for, regardless of what your plans are afterwards. So let's talk a little bit about why is student debt treated differently than other kinds of debt in our economy?
Yeah, it's a really interesting question, and something that I think, on one hand is just like a technocratic, like how what should our policy be? But
it's hugely impactful. It's hugely impactful.
Well, it's hugely impactful and turns out to actually be, I think, really philosophical, right? Because as a starting point, it shouldn't be different. One of the strangest things about, forgiving student loans and this sort of discussion is like, well, why aren't we forgiving auto loans, right? Like, what about all those people who borrowed money to buy a car? I bet they'd love you to,
so that they can get to their job, right, so that they can go and do their work.
Right. And yet we have this sort of strange concept of student debt in our minds. And I think what it starts from is that by default, student debt is just a terrible idea, right? Like from everybody's perspective. I mean, if you're a young person, you probably don't necessarily know what exactly you want to do. You are sort of trying to place this big bet with an uncertain return that is going to leave you on the hook for a long period of time. It's hard to believe that that's really the smart move for somebody to take that on. And again, some people, they know exactly what they want to do. They know they're going to be good at it. Yep. They've got the test scores. They're off, and that's fine. For an awful lot of people, really sort of a speculative risk to take. And then from the perspective of the lender, why on earth would you ever lend money to an 18-year-old with no credit history, no way to validate, right, how they're going to behave or what they're going to do with this money? Nothing you can take back, right? At least if someone defaults on their car loan, there's a car there. If someone defaults on their education loan, you can't take back their education. And so it's really a very foolish loan to make. And so by default, in fact, not a lot of these loans would get made. And for some reason, policymakers looked at this situation, and instead of concluding, gosh, we should really have an education system that's not premised on very young people going way into debt to finance something right, they're not sure they want or need, instead they said, no, this is exactly what we need. We should just create a set of policies to make sure everyone goes and does this, even though every party to the transaction is basically screaming, no, don't do this.
So how did that get formalized, and what has that created in terms of how we solve this mess? So this has created some structural, it's sort of put us in handcuffs in ways that having a more market-based lending system would allow for mistakes to resolve themselves.
Yeah, well, so the first thing that happened was the federal government came in and just said, we'll guarantee the loans. So we want people to make loans to these students, even though they're risky loans. So please just go ahead and do it. And if they get defaulted on, we will pick up the tab. At which point, of course, a lot of everyone said, great, sure. All right,
what could possibly go wrong?
Let's start handing out the money. In conjunction with that, then the government said, wait a minute, though. Now that we're on the hook for all of this, we're worried that these students are going to go get their education and then just declare bankruptcy, and there will be nothing for us to take back. So now let's add a rule also that you can't get rid of your loans in bankruptcy. So any other kind of debt, it's a somewhat unique, actually, American principle, and I think an incredibly important one, that we say, look, we expect you to repay your debts. If you get to the point where you can't, we actually do have this mechanism called bankruptcy. And we have an incredibly lenient bankruptcy system compared to the rest of the world. And we say, could someone abuse it? Yeah, maybe. But there are a lot of costs associated with declaring bankruptcy too, right? You have to forfeit a lot of assets. Your credit goes in the tank. You have reputational costs. And so we're basically going to trust someone's only going to declare bankruptcy if they kind of need the bankruptcy relief. And that turns out to be a really great system. And then we said, except student loans. Student loans, we've decided that education is so valuable, we don't care how much it costs. We're going to back you in spending as much as you want on education. And then we're going to turn around and tell you, no matter what, you can't get out from under that ever. That is our brilliant way of financing education, with the added bonus that because we structured it this way, guess what colleges and universities and all the people working there did? They said, well, great, then we're just going to keep making this more expensive and hiring more people and building our little empires. And it doesn't matter because the money is just going to keep flowing.